Question 1. The control framework reveals a proposal for a new investment product with novel features designed to appeal to a specific client segment. The product development team, eager to capture first-mover advantage, suggests proceeding with a limited post-launch review of the product's risk profile. Which of the following represents the most appropriate approach to risk assessment in this scenario? Option A. Conduct a thorough, forward-looking risk assessment that identifies all potential risks associated with the new product's unique features and operational requirements, evaluates the adequacy of existing controls, and determines if additional mitigation strategies are necessary before launch. Option B. Rely on the risk assessment conducted for similar, previously offered products, assuming the new product's risks will be largely the same. Option C. Delegate the entire risk assessment responsibility to the product development team, trusting their expertise to identify and manage all relevant risks. Option D. Defer the detailed risk assessment until after the product has been launched and initial client feedback is received, citing the need for speed to market. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough, forward-looking risk assessment that identifies all potential risks associated with the new product's unique features and operational requirements, evaluates the adequacy of existing controls, and determines if additional mitigation strategies are necessary before launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the assessment of a new product's inherent risks and the effectiveness of existing controls in a rapidly evolving market. The firm must balance innovation and client service with its regulatory obligations to manage risk prudently. A failure to adequately assess and mitigate risks could lead to significant financial losses, reputational damage, and regulatory sanction. The pressure to be first to market can sometimes lead to shortcuts in risk assessment, making rigorous adherence to the framework crucial. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, forward-looking risk assessment that considers the specific characteristics of the new product and its potential impact on the firm's risk profile. This includes identifying new risks, evaluating the adequacy of existing controls, and determining if additional controls or risk mitigation strategies are necessary before launch. This aligns with regulatory expectations, e.g., principles of sound risk management, prudential supervision, that firms must proactively identify, assess, and manage risks associated with their business activities. It demonstrates a commitment to client protection and market integrity by ensuring that new offerings are not introduced without due diligence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the fact that similar products have been offered in the past, without a specific assessment of the new products, unique features, and market context. This fails to acknowledge that risks can evolve and that a one-size-fits-all approach is insufficient. It could lead to regulatory breaches by not adhering to the principle of proportionate risk management and potentially exposing the firm to unforeseen risks. Another incorrect approach would be to defer the detailed risk assessment until after the product has been launched, citing the need for speed to market. This is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements that mandate risk assessment prior to the introduction of new products or services. It demonstrates a disregard for client protection and could result in significant harm to clients and the firm if issues arise. This approach prioritizes commercial gain over regulatory compliance and sound risk management. A third incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire risk assessment responsibility to the product development team without independent oversight or challenge from the risk management function. While the product team has deep knowledge of the product, they may lack the objective perspective and broader risk management expertise required for a comprehensive assessment. This failure in governance and oversight could lead to a biased or incomplete risk assessment, potentially missing critical control weaknesses and violating principles of robust internal control frameworks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, iterative, and objective approach to risk assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the business objective and the proposed product/service. 2. Identifying all potential risks, strategic, operational, financial, reputational, compliance, etc., associated with the new offering, considering its specific features, target market, and operational processes. 3. Evaluating the inherent risk level of each identified risk. 4. Assessing the effectiveness of existing controls designed to mitigate these risks. 5. Determining the residual risk level. 6. If residual risks are unacceptable, designing and implementing additional controls or mitigation strategies. 7. obtaining appropriate senior management and, where necessary, board approval before launch. 8. Establishing ongoing monitoring and review mechanism. This systematic process ensures that risks are understood, managed, and aligned with the firm's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. Question 2. Implementation of a risk assessment framework for a growing financial services firm requires careful consideration of various methodologies. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory expectations for identifying and mitigating financial crime risks in a dynamic business environment? Option A. Relying primarily on external audit reports to identify risks, assuming that third-party assessments will comprehensively cover all potential vulnerabilities without requiring internal risk assessment development. Option B. Developing a bespoke risk assessment methodology that considers the firm's specific business activities, client types, geographic locations, and the inherent risks associated with its products and services, allowing for a tailored and proportionate approach to risk mitigation. Option C. Adopting a widely available, off-the-shelf risk assessment template that covers common financial crime typologies, assuming it will adequately address the firm's unique risk profile due to its broad applicability. Option D. Prioritizing the implementation of a risk assessment process that is quickest and least expensive to deploy, focusing on high-level risk categories without delving into the specifics of the firm's operations or client base. The correct answer is B. Developing a bespoke risk assessment methodology that considers the firm's specific business activities, client types, geographic locations, and the inherent risks associated with its products and services, allowing for a tailored and proportionate approach to risk mitigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a firm to balance the need for efficient risk assessment with the regulatory imperative to conduct thorough and appropriate due diligence. The challenge lies in identifying a risk assessment methodology that is both practical for a growing firm and robust enough to meet regulatory expectations, particularly concerning the identification and mitigation of financial crime risks. Careful judgment is required to select a method that is not overly simplistic, which could lead to regulatory breaches, nor overly complex, which could hinder implementation and operational efficiency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of a risk-based approach mandated by regulatory frameworks. Specifically, it emphasizes understanding the firm's specific business model, client base, and the inherent risks associated with its operations. This allows for a tailored and proportionate risk assessment, ensuring that resources are focused on the highest risk areas. This aligns with regulatory guidance that expects firms to implement systems and controls that are commensurate with their risk profile. Ethical considerations also support this approach, as it demonstrates a commitment to responsible business conduct and the prevention of financial crime. An incorrect approach that relies solely on generic risk factors without considering the firm's unique context would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a tailored risk assessment and could lead to a misallocation of resources, leaving the firm vulnerable to risks it has not adequately identified or mitigated. This could be seen as a failure to implement adequate systems and controls, potentially breaching anti-money laundering (AML) or counter-terrorist financing (CTF) regulations. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed and cost-effectiveness over thoroughness would also be professionally unacceptable. While efficiency is important, it cannot come at the expense of regulatory compliance and effective risk management. A superficial risk assessment could lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and the facilitation of financial crime. This demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and a disregard for the firm's responsibilities. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the regulatory landscape. Identify all applicable laws, regulations, and guidance related to risk assessment and financial crime prevention. 2. Assess the firm's specific context. Analyze the business model, client types, geographic reach, products, and services offered. 3. Identify inherent risks. Determine the potential risks the firm faces, such as money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, and market abuse. 4. Evaluate existing controls. Review the effectiveness of current risk mitigation measures. 5. Select an appropriate methodology. Choose a risk assessment methodology that is proportionate to the firm's size, complexity, and risk profile, ensuring it is sufficiently granular. 6. Document the process. Maintain clear and comprehensive records of the risk assessment methodology, findings, and decisions. 7. Implement and monitor. Put the findings into action and regularly review and update the risk assessment. Question 3. The assessment process reveals that a financial advisory firm is seeking to implement a new client onboarding procedure. The firm needs to select the most appropriate risk assessment approach to ensure compliance and protect client interests. Which of the following approaches best balances thoroughness, adaptability, and regulatory adherence for this specific scenario? Option A. A purely quantitative risk assessment that relies solely on historical data and statistical models to predict potential risks, without considering qualitative factors or expert opinion. Option B. A qualitative risk assessment that involves expert judgment to identify potential risks, followed by a structured analysis of their likelihood and impact, and the development of tailored mitigation strategies. Option C. A reactive risk assessment that is only triggered when a specific incident or complaint occurs, rather than being a proactive and ongoing process. Option D. A checklist-based risk identification process that focuses on ticking boxes for common risks, without in-depth analysis of their specific relevance or potential impact to the firm's operations. The correct answer is B. A qualitative risk assessment that involves expert judgment to identify potential risks, followed by a structured analysis of their likelihood and impact, and the development of tailored mitigation strategies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to move beyond a superficial understanding of risk assessment and apply it in a dynamic, real-world context. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate methodology for a specific situation, considering the limitations and strengths of each. It demands critical thinking to discern which approach best aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical obligations for robust risk management. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic and comprehensive evaluation of potential risks. This involves not just identifying risks, but also assessing their likelihood and impact, and then determining appropriate mitigation strategies. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate proactive risk management to protect clients, the firm, and market integrity. Ethically, it demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and responsible conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by focusing solely on the identification of risks without a subsequent analysis of their potential impact or likelihood. This is a regulatory failure as it does not meet the requirement for a thorough risk assessment, leaving the firm vulnerable to unmanaged threats. Ethically, it represents a lack of diligence and a failure to adequately protect stakeholders. Another incorrect approach is to rely on historical data alone, without considering emerging or novel risks. This is a regulatory failure because it can lead to a false sense of security and an inability to adapt to changing market conditions or new threats, potentially violating prudential requirements. Ethically, it shows a lack of foresight and a failure to exercise professional judgment in anticipating future challenges. A third incorrect approach involves applying a generic risk assessment framework without tailoring it to the specific business activities and the firm's risk appetite. This is a regulatory failure as it may not adequately address the unique risks faced by the firm, leading to non-compliance with specific regulatory obligations. Ethically, it demonstrates a superficial engagement with risk management, failing to uphold the duty of care. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach risk assessment by first understanding the firm's business model, regulatory environment, and risk appetite. They should then select a methodology that allows for comprehensive identification, analysis, and evaluation of risks, considering both quantitative and qualitative factors. This process should be iterative, with regular reviews and updates to reflect changes in the internal and external environment. The decision-making process should be guided by regulatory requirements, ethical principles, and the need to maintain sound risk management practices. Question 4. The evaluation methodology shows a tendency to rely heavily on historical loss data to quantify potential future risks, with less emphasis placed on how these risks might impact the firm's long-term strategic goals or its stated risk appetite in a changing regulatory environment. Option A. Increase the reliance on historical data to ensure a statistically robust assessment of potential future risk events. Option B. Integrate qualitative assessments of strategic impact and alignment with the firm's risk appetite into the quantitative analysis of historical data. Option C. Focus solely on identifying the broadest possible range of potential risks, irrespective of their strategic relevance or materiality. Option D. Adopt external industry benchmarks for risk assessment without considering the firm's specific operational context or strategic objectives. The correct answer is B. Integrate qualitative assessments of strategic impact and alignment with the firm's risk appetite into the quantitative analysis of historical data. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to move beyond a purely quantitative assessment of risk to incorporate qualitative factors and strategic alignment. The firm's risk appetite, while a guiding principle, is not a static number but a dynamic concept influenced by market conditions, regulatory changes, and the firm's strategic objectives. Simply focusing on historical data without considering future implications or the qualitative impact of a risk event can lead to misinformed decisions. The challenge lies in balancing objective data with subjective judgment and ensuring that risk assessment directly supports the firm's overarching goals. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves integrating quantitative risk metrics with qualitative assessments that consider the firm's strategic objectives and risk appetite. This aligns with best professional practice because it acknowledges that risk is not solely a function of probability and impact, but also of how that risk affects the firm's ability to achieve its strategic goals. Regulatory frameworks often emphasize a holistic approach to risk management, requiring firms to understand not just the likelihood and consequence of an event, but also its potential to disrupt business operations, damage reputation, or impede strategic initiatives. This approach ensures that risk mitigation efforts are proportionate and strategically relevant, rather than being driven by isolated data points. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on historical data to predict future risk events. This fails to account for evolving market dynamics, new regulatory requirements, or emerging threats that may not be reflected in past data. Ethically, this can lead to a false sense of security or an underestimation of novel risks, potentially breaching a duty of care to clients and the firm. Another incorrect approach prioritizes the identification of all potential risks, regardless of their materiality or alignment with the firm's strategic objectives. While comprehensive risk identification is important, an unfocused approach can lead to resource misallocation and a dilution of efforts on risks that truly matter to the firm's success. This can be seen as a failure in professional judgment and potentially a breach of fiduciary duty if it leads to inefficient use of firm resources. A third incorrect approach relies exclusively on external benchmarks without considering the firm's unique operational context and risk appetite. While benchmarks provide valuable external perspective, they do not capture the specific nuances of a firm's business model, internal controls, or strategic priorities. Adopting external benchmarks without adaptation can lead to inappropriate risk tolerance levels and misaligned risk management strategies, potentially violating internal policies and regulatory expectations for tailored risk management. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the firm's strategic objectives and risk appetite. This understanding should then inform the selection of appropriate risk assessment methodologies, which should combine quantitative analysis with qualitative judgment. The process should involve continuous monitoring and review, adapting the risk assessment as market conditions, regulatory landscapes, and the firm's strategic priorities evolve. This iterative approach ensures that risk management remains a dynamic and value-adding function, rather than a static compliance exercise. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that a recently implemented automated data entry system, designed to streamline client onboarding, has inadvertently created a significant delay in the final verification stage, impacting the overall turnaround time. Option A. Implement a temporary workaround by manually re-entering data from the automated system into a separate spreadsheet for verification, without assessing the long-term viability or regulatory implications of this dual process. Option B. Immediately revert to the previous manual data entry process to restore the original turnaround times, without further investigation into the new system's performance. Option C. Conduct a detailed audit of the automated system's data flow and integration points with the verification module, identifying specific points of friction and proposing targeted adjustments that maintain data integrity and comply with all relevant financial regulations. Option D. Expedite the verification stage by reducing the number of checks performed, prioritizing speed over absolute accuracy to meet client expectations. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed audit of the automated system's data flow and integration points with the verification module, identifying specific points of friction, and proposing targeted adjustments that maintain data integrity and comply with all relevant financial regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a newly implemented process, intended to improve efficiency, has inadvertently created a new bottleneck. The challenge lies in identifying the root cause of this inefficiency without compromising regulatory compliance or client service standards. It requires a nuanced understanding of operational workflows and their impact on both internal processes and external client interactions, demanding careful judgment to balance speed with accuracy and adherence to established protocols. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the new process's impact on all stages of the workflow, from initial data input to final output. This includes cross-referencing the new process with existing regulatory requirements and internal control frameworks. By identifying the specific step causing the delay and proposing a targeted adjustment that aligns with regulatory guidelines and maintains data integrity, this approach upholds best professional practice. It demonstrates a commitment to continuous improvement while ensuring that all actions are compliant and ethically sound, safeguarding both the firm and its clients. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on reverting to the old process without a thorough analysis. This fails to address the underlying issues that prompted the efficiency study in the first place and ignores the potential benefits of the new system. It represents a failure in professional problem solving and a disregard for the investment made in process improvement. Another incorrect approach is to bypass established quality control checks to speed up the process. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It directly contravenes guidelines that mandate accuracy and completeness in financial operations, potentially leading to errors, misreporting, and breaches of client trust. Such an approach prioritizes speed over integrity, which is unacceptable in a regulated environment. A third incorrect approach involves implementing a quick fix without consulting relevant stakeholders or assessing its broader impact. This can lead to unintended consequences, creating new problems or violating other operational procedures. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to consider the interconnectedness of business processes, potentially leading to further inefficiencies or compliance issues. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured problem-solving methodology. This involves clearly defining the problem, gathering data, analyzing root causes, developing potential solutions, evaluating these solutions against regulatory, ethical, and operational criteria, and then implementing and monitoring the chosen solution. In situations of process inefficiency, it is crucial to involve relevant teams, consult regulatory guidance, and prioritize solutions that enhance efficiency without compromising compliance or client service. Question 6. Investigation of how a financial advisor should respond when a client insists on retaining an investment that objective analysis suggests is no longer suitable for their portfolio, despite the advisor's fiduciary duty to recommend changes that align with the client's stated financial goals and risk tolerance. Option A. Immediately implement the client's request to retain the investment without further analysis, prioritizing client satisfaction over the advisor's professional judgment and fiduciary responsibilities. Option B. Inform the client that their request cannot be accommodated due to the investment's poor performance and unilaterally make changes to the portfolio without detailed explanation or client consultation. Option C. Focus solely on the historical performance data of the requested investment, disregarding current market trends and the client's evolving financial circumstances when making a recommendation. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of the client's entire portfolio, considering their stated financial goals, risk tolerance, and current market conditions. Clearly communicate the findings and the rationale for any recommended adjustments, even if it means challenging the client's initial preference, to ensure the advice remains in the client's best interest. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of the client's entire portfolio, considering their stated financial goals, risk tolerance, and current market conditions. Clearly communicate the findings and the rationale for any recommended adjustments, even if it means challenging the client's initial preference, to ensure the advice remains in the client's best interest. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the firm's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional attachment to a specific investment, which may be underperforming or unsuitable, against the objective assessment of their financial goals and risk tolerance. This requires a delicate balance of communication, education, and ethical adherence. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's long-term financial well-being and adhering to regulatory obligations. This involves a thorough, objective review of the client's portfolio in light of their stated objectives and risk profile. The advisor must then clearly and transparently communicate their findings, explaining the rationale behind any recommended changes, even if it means challenging the client's initial preference. This aligns with the principles of suitability and fiduciary duty, which mandate that financial advice must be in the client's best interest, irrespective of the advisor's personal gain or the client's immediate emotional desires. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing investment advisors, typically require such a client-centric approach. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately capitulating to the client's demand to retain the underperforming asset without further investigation. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. It prioritizes client satisfaction in the short term over their long-term financial health, potentially exposing them to continued losses or missed opportunities. This could be considered a breach of regulatory requirements mandating suitability and prudent investment management. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's concerns outright and unilaterally make changes without adequate explanation or client engagement. This demonstrates a lack of respect for the client's perspective and can erode trust. While the advisor may be acting in what they believe is the client's best interest, the failure to communicate and educate the client about the rationale behind the decisions is a significant professional and ethical failing. It bypasses the client's right to understand and consent to their investment strategy, potentially violating principles of informed consent and transparency. A third incorrect approach might be to focus solely on the historical performance of the asset, ignoring current market conditions or the client's evolving circumstances. This demonstrates a lack of forward-looking analysis and a failure to adapt the investment strategy to the client's current needs and future goals. It also neglects the advisor's responsibility to provide advice based on a comprehensive understanding of the client's overall financial picture. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation. This is followed by an objective analysis of the suitability of existing investments. When a discrepancy arises between client preference and objective assessment, the professional must engage in open and honest communication, educating the client on the rationale for their recommendations. This process emphasizes transparency, client empowerment, and adherence to regulatory and ethical standards, ensuring that all decisions are made with the client's best interests as the paramount consideration. Question 7. What factors determine the effectiveness of a new compliance training program in fostering a culture of adherence to regulatory requirements? Option A. A combination of knowledge retention assessment, observed behavioral changes, and feedback from participants and supervisors. Option B. The overall satisfaction ratings provided by the training participants. Option C. The number of employees who attended the training session. Option D. The reduction in minor administrative errors following the training period. The correct answer is A. A combination of knowledge retention assessments, observed behavioral changes, and feedback from participants and supervisors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in evaluating the effectiveness of a new compliance training program. The challenge lies in moving beyond superficial metrics to assess genuine behavioral change and understanding of regulatory requirements. Without a robust evaluation framework, the firm risks investing resources in ineffective training, potentially leading to continued compliance breaches and regulatory scrutiny. The need for objective, actionable insights necessitates a thoughtful approach to assessment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach focuses on a multifaceted evaluation that combines quantitative and qualitative data to measure the impact of the training. This includes assessing knowledge retention through post-training assessments, observing behavioral changes in day-to-day activities, and gathering feedback from both trainees and their supervisors. This comprehensive method aligns with best practices in adult learning and compliance program effectiveness, ensuring that the training not only imparts knowledge, but also fosters a culture of compliance. Regulatory frameworks often emphasize demonstrable effectiveness of compliance programs, which this approach directly addresses by providing evidence of improved understanding and adherence to rules. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach relies solely on attendance records. This is a failure because attendance does not guarantee comprehension or application of the training material. It is a superficial metric that offers no insight into whether the training was effective in changing behavior or improving compliance. Ethically, it misrepresents the effectiveness of the program to stakeholders. Another incorrect approach focuses only on trainee satisfaction surveys. While feedback is valuable, satisfaction alone does not equate to learning or behavioral change. Trainees might feel the training was enjoyable or well delivered without actually internalizing the key compliance messages. This approach risks overlooking critical knowledge gaps or areas where behavior has not improved, potentially leading to future compliance issues. A third incorrect approach measures only the reduction in minor administrative errors. While positive, this is too narrow. Compliance training typically aims to address a broader range of risks, including significant regulatory breaches. Focusing only on minor errors may mask more serious underlying issues or a lack of understanding of more complex regulatory obligations. This approach fails to provide a holistic view of the training's impact on the firm's overall compliance posture. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the evaluation of training programs with a critical mindset, seeking to understand the true impact rather than relying on easily obtainable but less meaningful data. The decision-making process should involve defining clear learning objectives for the training, identifying appropriate metrics to measure progress against those objectives, and employing a mix of assessment methods. This ensures that the evaluation is robust, provides actionable insights for improvement, and demonstrates the value of compliance initiatives to the organization and its regulators. Question 8. When evaluating a request for client-specific operational data from an internal department for a project that is not yet formally approved, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with data protection principles and maintain professional integrity? Option A. Seek clarification on the exact data required, the intended use, and the project status to determine the appropriate level of access and disclosure, potentially involving data anonymization or consent if necessary. Option B. Inform the requesting department that no client data can be shared without formal project approval and a clear data request form. Option C. Share a general overview of the types of data typically handled without disclosing any specific client details. Option D. Provide the requested data immediately to facilitate the internal project, assuming good faith from the requesting department. The correct answer is A. Seek clarification on the exact data required, the intended use, and the project status to determine the appropriate level of access and disclosure, potentially involving data anonymization or consent if necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the obligation to protect client confidentiality and adhere to data handling regulations. The pressure to provide a quick response can lead to shortcuts that compromise these fundamental principles. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are compliant and ethical. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes data security and regulatory compliance. By seeking to understand the specific data requirements and the intended use, the professional ensures that any information shared is done so appropriately, with necessary consent or within legal exemptions. This aligns with the principles of data protection, such as data minimization and purpose limitation, which are core tenets of regulations designed to safeguard personal information. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible data stewardship and builds trust with clients and stakeholders. An incorrect approach that involves sharing the requested data without verifying its necessity or the recipient's authorization fails to uphold data protection principles. This could lead to a breach of confidentiality and non-compliance with regulations like GDPR. if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, or similar data privacy laws, resulting in potential fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which is to refuse to provide any information whatsoever without further inquiry, might be overly cautious and hinder legitimate business operations or client support, potentially violating service-level agreements or demonstrating a lack of helpfulness, even if technically compliant with a strict interpretation of data secrecy. Third incorrect approach, which is to provide a generic, non-specific overview of services without addressing the actual data query, fails to meet the requester's needs and could be seen as evasive, potentially leading to frustration and a breakdown in communication, even if it avoids direct data disclosure. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the request and its context. This involves identifying the nature of the information sought, the purpose for which it is needed, and the identity and legitimacy of the requester. Subsequently, the professional must assess the applicable regulatory requirements and internal policies governing data access and disclosure. If the request appears legitimate but requires sensitive information, the next step is to explore secure and compliant methods of data provision, which may involve anonymization, aggregation, or obtaining explicit consent. If the request cannot be fulfilled compliantly, the professional should clearly communicate the limitations and offer alternative, compliant solutions. Question 9. Benchmark analysis indicates that a firm's compliance department has received an anonymous tip alleging that a key client, a significant institutional investor, may be engaging in insider trading based on non-public information obtained through their relationship with the firm. The compliance officer is aware that the client's trading activity in a particular security has recently been unusually active and profitable. What is the most appropriate course of action for the compliance officer to take in this situation? Option A. Disregard the anonymous tip due to the client's importance to the firm and the potential for reputational damage if the tip is unfounded. Option B. Initiate a discreet internal investigation to gather and analyze evidence related to the alleged insider trading, consulting with legal and senior compliance personnel before making any determination on reporting to the regulator. Option C. Immediately report the anonymous tip and the client's recent trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority without conducting any internal review. Option D. Advise the client of the anonymous tip and request an explanation for their recent trading activity before proceeding with any further action. The correct answer is B. Initiate a discreet internal investigation to gather and analyze evidence related to the alleged insider trading, consulting with legal and senior compliance personnel before making any determination on reporting to the regulator. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in balancing client confidentiality with the need to report potential market abuse. The firm's compliance officer must navigate the delicate line between protecting client information and fulfilling regulatory obligations to maintain market integrity. This requires a nuanced understanding of both legal duties and ethical considerations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented internal investigation that prioritizes gathering sufficient evidence to substantiate the suspicion of insider trading without prematurely breaching client confidentiality. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on robust internal controls and a proactive approach to identifying and reporting market abuse. The process should involve discrete information gathering, analysis of trading patterns, and consultation with legal and compliance teams to determine if a formal report to the regulator is warranted. This approach upholds the principle of innocent until proven guilty, while ensuring that regulatory obligations are met if evidence supports a breach. It reflects best professional practice by demonstrating due diligence, adherence to internal policies, and a commitment to regulatory compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately report the suspicion to the regulator without conducting any internal investigation. This could lead to an unfounded accusation, damaging the client's reputation and potentially incurring legal repercussions for the firm if the suspicion proves baseless. It fails to uphold the duty of care to the client and bypasses the firm's internal control mechanisms designed to prevent erroneous reporting. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the suspicion due to the client's importance or the potential for reputational damage to the firm. This constitutes a serious regulatory and ethical failure. It directly contravenes the firm's obligation to prevent and detect market abuse, undermining market integrity, and exposing the firm to significant penalties. It also demonstrates a lack of professional integrity and a disregard for the firm's compliance responsibilities. A third incorrect approach would be to inform the client of the suspicion and ask for their explanation before conducting any investigation. This risks tipping off the client, allowing them to destroy evidence or alter their behavior, thereby obstructing a potential investigation by the regulator. It also breaches client confidentiality in an unauthorized manner and undermines the integrity of the firm's internal compliance processes. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This begins with identifying the potential regulatory breach and its implications. Next, they should consult relevant internal policies and regulatory guidance. A critical step is to gather all available information discreetly and objectively, documenting each step. This information should then be analyzed by a designated team e.g., compliance, legal, to assess the strength of the evidence. Based on this assessment, a decision is made regarding further action, which may include escalating the matter internally, reporting to the regulator, or concluding that no breach has occurred. Throughout this process, maintaining client confidentiality where possible and adhering to ethical principles are paramount. Question 10. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to significantly improve the firm's profitability within the next fiscal year. Management is considering several cost reduction strategies. Which of the following approaches best balances the imperative for financial improvement with the firm's professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Implement immediate, across-the-board reductions in staffing levels for client-facing roles to achieve rapid cost savings. Option B. Outsource key client advisory functions to an offshore provider with a lower cost structure, without extensive due diligence on their regulatory compliance. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of all operational processes to identify areas for efficiency gains and potential technology-driven automation, involving relevant departments like compliance and client services in the assessment. Option D. Significantly reduce the budget allocated to compliance training and the maintenance of regulatory reporting systems. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of all operational processes to identify areas for efficiency gains and potential technology-driven automation, involving relevant departments like compliance and client services in the assessment. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost reduction with the long-term implications of service quality and client trust. The firm is under pressure to improve profitability, but implementing changes without thorough consideration of their impact on client experience and regulatory compliance could lead to significant reputational damage and potential sanctions. The challenge lies in identifying cost-saving measures that are both effective and ethically sound, aligning with the firm's duty to its clients and regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of operational processes to identify inefficiencies that do not compromise service delivery or regulatory adherence. This includes engaging with relevant teams, such as compliance and client relationship managers, to understand the practical implications of any proposed changes. The focus should be on optimizing existing workflows, leveraging technology for automation where appropriate, and renegotiating supplier contracts. This method represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a data-driven, collaborative, and risk-aware strategy. It aligns with regulatory expectations for firms to maintain robust internal controls and to act in the best interests of their clients. Ethically, it upholds the principle of prudence and responsible management of firm resources without sacrificing client welfare or compliance standards. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately implement across-the-board cuts to client-facing staff without a detailed analysis of workload distribution or service impact. This fails to consider the firm's duty to provide adequate client service and could lead to breaches of regulatory requirements related to client care and supervision. It also risks damaging client relationships and the firm's reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to outsource core client advisory functions to a less regulated or lower-cost jurisdiction without a thorough due diligence process. This poses significant risks related to data security, confidentiality, and the quality of advice provided, potentially violating data protection laws and professional conduct rules. It also undermines the firm's direct responsibility for client outcomes. A third incorrect approach would be to reduce investment in compliance training and systems to save costs. This is a direct contravention of regulatory mandates that require firms to maintain adequate compliance resources and to ensure staff are properly trained. Such a decision would expose the firm to significant regulatory penalties and operational risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a challenge should adopt a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly defining the objective cost reduction and any constraints maintaining service quality regulatory compliance. 2. Gathering comprehensive data on current operations costs and client feedback. 3. Identifying potential solutions and assessing their risks and benefits, including regulatory and ethical implications. 4. Consulting with relevant stakeholders, including compliance, legal, and operational teams. 5. Developing a phased implementation plan with clear metrics for success and ongoing monitoring. 6. Prioritizing solutions that offer sustainable cost savings without compromising client interests or regulatory obligations. Question 11. System analysis indicates that a firm's daily reconciliation process for trade data is encountering discrepancies between two key systems, leading to potential inaccuracies in end-of-day regulatory reporting. The discrepancies are attributed to differing update frequencies of the two systems. The firm needs to implement a solution to ensure accurate and timely regulatory submissions. Option A. Increase the tolerance level for discrepancies in the reconciliation process to accommodate the observed differences before generating the end-of-day report. Option B. Instruct the reporting team to disregard any discrepancies identified by the reconciliation process, assuming they are minor and will not significantly impact regulatory filings. Option C. Advise the operations team to manually investigate and correct all identified discrepancies after the end-of-day report has been finalized. Option D. Implement automated reconciliation checks that run at a higher frequency throughout the day, or adjust system update schedules to ensure data synchronization before the end-of-day reporting cutoff. Correct answer is D. Implement automated reconciliation checks that run at a higher frequency throughout the day, or adjust system update schedules to ensure data synchronization before the end-of-day reporting cutoff. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in financial services, balancing the need for efficient data processing with the imperative to maintain data integrity and comply with regulatory reporting requirements. The challenge lies in the potential for data discrepancies arising from different system update frequencies, which could lead to inaccurate regulatory filings and operational inefficiencies. Careful judgment is required to identify the root cause of the discrepancies and implement a sustainable solution that upholds compliance standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough root cause analysis to understand why the reconciliation process is failing to identify and correct discrepancies before the end-of-day reporting. This aligns with the principles of robust internal controls and accurate financial reporting mandated by regulatory bodies. By implementing automated reconciliation checks that run more frequently, or by adjusting the timing of system updates to ensure data consistency, the firm demonstrates a commitment to data accuracy and regulatory compliance. This proactive stance prevents potential breaches of reporting obligations and ensures that the firm's financial position is accurately reflected. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply adjust the reporting threshold to accommodate the discrepancies. This is a failure to address the underlying data integrity issue and could lead to the reporting of inaccurate information, violating regulatory requirements for truthful and complete submissions. It masks the problem rather than solving it. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the discrepancies and assume they will self-correct. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact of inaccurate data on regulatory filings and business decisions. It also fails to meet the ethical obligation to maintain accurate records. A third incorrect approach is to manually correct all discrepancies after the end-of-day report has been generated. While this might eventually lead to accurate data, it is inefficient, prone to human error, and does not address the systemic issue causing the discrepancies in the first place. It also means that the initial report was inaccurate, which could have regulatory implications. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a challenge should adopt a systematic approach. First, clearly define the problem and its potential impact. Second, investigate the root cause through data analysis and system review. Third, evaluate potential solutions based on their effectiveness, efficiency, and regulatory compliance. Fourth, implement the chosen solution and monitor its performance. Finally, document the process and outcomes for audit and future reference. This structured decision-making process ensures that issues are resolved effectively and in line with professional and regulatory standards. Question 12. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a long-standing client who previously expressed a strong preference for low-risk, income-generating investments has recently made several inquiries about more aggressive growth opportunities and expressed concerns about inflation eroding the purchasing power of their current portfolio. The firm's compliance department is seeking to understand how the investment advisory team is addressing this apparent shift in client sentiment. Option A. Schedule a follow-up meeting in 3 months to discuss the client's concerns further after observing market performance. Option B. Initiate a formal review of the client's investment strategy, reassessing their risk tolerance and objectives in light of the new feedback, and documenting any proposed adjustments. Option C. Advise the client that their current portfolio is designed for stability and that pursuing growth opportunities would be outside their established investment mandate. Option D. Proceed with executing trades that align with the client's recent inquiries about growth opportunities, assuming these are isolated requests. The correct answer is B. Initiate a formal review of the client's investment strategy, reassessing their risk tolerance and objectives in light of the new feedback, and documenting any proposed adjustments. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client needs with regulatory compliance, a common theme in financial services. The firm must ensure that its advice aligns with the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, while also adhering to the specific disclosure and suitability requirements mandated by the Flex hiring assessment tests governing regulations. The professional challenge lies in interpreting the client's evolving feedback and determining when it necessitates a formal review of the investment strategy versus simply adjusting execution. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured and documented process for evaluating significant changes in client circumstances or objectives. This aligns with the regulatory imperative to provide suitable advice and to maintain adequate records of client interactions and decisions. By initiating a formal review, the firm demonstrates due diligence, ensures that any revised strategy is thoroughly assessed against regulatory standards, and provides a clear audit trail. This proactive stance protects both the client and the firm from potential compliance breaches and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate execution without a formal review fails to adequately address the potential shift in the client's investment profile. This could lead to advice that is no longer suitable, violating the core principles of client centricity and regulatory obligations. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the feedback as minor overlooks the potential for cumulative impact or a fundamental change in the client's risk appetite, thereby failing to uphold the duty of care. Finally, an approach that delays the review process to gather more information without acknowledging the immediate need for assessment risks providing advice that is out of sync with the client's current needs and regulatory expectations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's initial objectives and risk profile. When client feedback suggests a deviation from these parameters, the professional should assess the significance of the feedback. If the feedback indicates a potential change in objectives, risk tolerance, or financial situation, a formal review process should be triggered. This process should involve documenting the client's updated input, reevaluating the suitability of existing recommendations, and if necessary, proposing and implementing a revised strategy, all while ensuring full compliance with disclosure and record-keeping requirements. Question 13. Upon reviewing a client's portfolio, a client expresses a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their funds into a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that has recently experienced a surge in value, but carries substantial inherent risks and is not aligned with their stated long-term financial goals and moderate risk tolerance. The client insists on proceeding immediately, citing a fear of missing out. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, but allocate only a small token amount to satisfy their immediate desire, while recommending a more conservative allocation for the majority of their funds. Option B. Advise the client that the proposed investment is entirely unsuitable and refuse to facilitate the transaction, suggesting they seek advice elsewhere if they are determined to proceed. Option C. Immediately execute the client's requested transaction, as the client is the ultimate decision maker for their investments, and include a comprehensive disclaimer outlining the risks involved. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for this sudden interest, explain the risks associated with the speculative asset class, and explore alternative investments that align with their stated objectives and risk profile, while documenting the conversation thoroughly. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for this sudden interest, explain the risks associated with the speculative asset class, and explore alternative investments that align with their stated objectives and risk profile, while documenting the conversation thoroughly. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to a detrimental outcome, possibly contravening regulatory principles. The advisor must navigate the client's autonomy while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to regulatory requirements designed to protect clients and market integrity. The challenge lies in balancing persuasive communication with the obligation to act in the client's best interest, especially when the client's understanding of risk or suitability may be limited. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before making any recommendations. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability assessments and client due diligence. By engaging in a detailed discussion to ascertain the client's true needs and understanding, the advisor fulfills their ethical and regulatory obligation to ensure that any proposed investment is appropriate for the client. This proactive approach prevents misaligned expectations and potential future complaints or regulatory breaches. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately proceeding with the client's stated preference without further inquiry. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for suitability and due diligence. It prioritizes client instruction over the advisor's professional responsibility to assess appropriateness, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating principles of client protection. This could lead to regulatory sanctions for failing to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying motivation or exploring alternatives. While the advisor may believe the request is unsuitable, a complete dismissal can damage the client relationship and may not address the client's actual financial goals. Ethically, it can be seen as paternalistic and failing to engage in a collaborative advisory process. Regulatory frameworks often encourage open dialogue and education. A third incorrect approach is to proceed with the client's request but include extensive disclaimers. While disclaimers are a part of risk management, they cannot absolve an advisor of their primary duty to ensure suitability. Relying solely on disclaimers to mitigate risk when a recommendation is fundamentally inappropriate is a failure of professional judgment and a potential regulatory loophole exploitation. It suggests a lack of commitment to the client's well-being. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with comprehensive client profiling. This involves active listening, probing questions, and a clear articulation of risks and benefits. When a client's request appears misaligned with their profile, the professional's duty is to educate, explore alternatives, and document the entire process, including the rationale for any recommendation or the decision not to proceed with a specific request. The focus should always be on informed consent and suitability, underpinned by regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. Question 14. The audit findings indicate that the firm's current system for managing client financial records lacks granular access controls, with many employees having broad access to sensitive client data, irrespective of their direct involvement in client account management. Furthermore, the audit noted an absence of a formal data retention policy and insufficient logging of data access. What is the most appropriate course of action to address these findings and ensure compliance with data protection regulations? Option A. Immediately delete all client data that is older than 1 year to minimize the risk of unauthorized access. Option B. Provide all employees with additional training on data security best practices and rely on existing password protection measures for client data. Option C. Implement a role-based access control system that grants employees access only to the client data necessary for their specific job functions. Establish a clear data retention policy aligned with regulatory requirements, and enhance data access logging for auditability. Option D. Grant all employees read-only access to all client financial records to ensure transparency and facilitate quick information retrieval. Correct answer is C. Implement a role-based access control system that grants employees access only to the client data necessary for their specific job functions. Establish a clear data retention policy aligned with regulatory requirements, and enhance data access logging for auditability. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential breach in the firm's data handling procedures, specifically concerning the secure storage and access of client information. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient data access for business operations with the paramount duty to protect client confidentiality and comply with data protection regulations. Mismanagement of client data can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and loss of client trust. The correct approach, which involves implementing a robust, multi-layered access control system with regular audits and clear data retention policies, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and security enshrined in data protection laws. It demonstrates a proactive commitment to safeguarding sensitive information, ensuring that only authorized personnel have access to client data on a need-to-know basis, and that data is retained only for as long as necessary, thereby minimizing the risk of unauthorized disclosure or misuse. An incorrect approach that involves granting broad access to all employees based on their role without granular controls fails to adequately protect client data. This violates the principle of data minimization and security, as it exposes information to individuals who do not require it for their specific duties, increasing the risk of accidental or intentional breaches. Such a practice is a direct contravention of data protection regulations that mandate appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure data security. Another incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on password protection for all client data without any further access controls or audit trails, is also professionally unacceptable. While password protection is a basic security measure, it is insufficient on its own. It does not prevent unauthorized access once a password is compromised, nor does it provide a mechanism to track who accessed what data and when, which is crucial for accountability and incident response. This approach neglects the requirement for ongoing monitoring and robust security measures. A further incorrect approach, which is to delete all client data immediately after a transaction is completed, might seem like a way to reduce risk, but it can also be problematic. It may violate regulatory requirements for record keeping and data retention, which often mandate keeping client data for specific periods for compliance and audit purposes. Furthermore, it could hinder future client service or the ability to respond to inquiries or disputes. A professional decision-making process for such situations should involve a thorough risk assessment of current data handling practices, a comprehensive review of applicable regulatory requirements, such as GDPR if the jurisdiction is the UK, and the development of a clear policy that prioritizes data security and client confidentiality. This policy should be communicated to all staff, and regular training should be provided. Implementing technical controls, such as encryption and access logs, alongside organizational measures like clear roles and responsibilities, is essential. Regular review and updating of these measures are also critical to adapt to evolving threats and regulatory landscapes. Question 15. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of regulatory breaches related to client asset segregation if the new Client Asset Protection Directive is not fully implemented within 6 months. Given the firm's current IT infrastructure limitations and the need for extensive staff training, which implementation approach best balances compliance urgency with operational integrity and client protection? Option A. Prioritize the immediate deployment of a new IT system designed to meet the directive's requirements, assuming staff will adapt quickly and address procedural gaps through on-the-job learning. Option B. Implement the directive in phases, starting with a pilot program for a specific client segment, followed by a gradual rollout across all operations, incorporating system upgrades and comprehensive staff training at each stage. Option C. Delay the full implementation of the directive until all necessary IT infrastructure upgrades are completed and a comprehensive training program is developed, even if this means exceeding the initial 6-month compliance deadline. Option D. Immediately enforce the new directive using manual workarounds and supplementary checklists while deferring significant IT system upgrades and formal training until after the initial compliance deadline. Correct answer is B. Implement the directive in phases, starting with a pilot program for a specific client segment, followed by a gradual rollout across all operations, incorporating system upgrades and comprehensive staff training at each stage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge where a new regulatory requirement, the Client Asset Protection Directive, necessitates significant changes to existing operational processes. The challenge lies in balancing the urgency of compliance with the practicalities of system integration and staff training. A rushed implementation could lead to operational errors, client detriment, and regulatory breaches. Conversely, an overly cautious approach risks non-compliance and potential penalties. The firm must navigate these competing demands while ensuring client interests remain paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a phased implementation strategy. This demonstrates best professional practice by acknowledging the complexity of the new directive and the need for thorough planning and execution. A phased approach allows for 1. Detailed impact assessment, understanding precisely how the directive affects each business process and system. 2. System development and testing, ensuring that any necessary IT changes are robust and thoroughly tested before deployment. 3. Comprehensive staff training, equipping employees with the knowledge and skills to comply with the new requirements. 4. Pilot testing, allowing for real-world validation of the new processes in a controlled environment before full rollout. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of errors, ensures client assets are protected effectively from the outset, and aligns with the spirit and letter of regulatory requirements, such as those found in the FCA's Client Asset Sourcebook, CAS, in the UK, which mandates robust controls for safeguarding client assets. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing the new directive immediately without adequate system upgrades or staff training represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach prioritizes speed over accuracy and client protection, directly contravening the principles of treating customers fairly and maintaining adequate controls, as expected by regulators like the FCA. It increases the likelihood of operational errors, such as incorrect segregation of client assets or misreporting, leading to potential breaches of CAS rules and client detriment. Attempting to implement the directive solely through manual workarounds while deferring system upgrades is also professionally unacceptable. While it might seem like a short-term solution, it introduces a high risk of human error and is unsustainable. It fails to establish robust, automated controls, which are a cornerstone of effective client asset protection. This approach neglects the directive's intent to embed compliance within the firm's infrastructure and processes, risking non-compliance and potential client harm. Focusing only on the technical system upgrade without considering the necessary staff training and procedural changes is another flawed approach. Technology alone cannot guarantee compliance. Employees need to understand the why and how of the new directive and their role in adhering to it. A lack of training can lead to misuse of the new systems or a failure to follow the correct procedures, undermining the entire implementation effort and potentially leading to regulatory breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such implementation challenges should adopt a structured, risk-based decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the regulatory mandate, thoroughly analyzing the specific requirements of the directive. 2. Conducting a comprehensive impact assessment, identifying all affected processes, systems, and personnel. 3. Prioritizing client protection, ensuring that all decisions and actions safeguard client assets and interests. 4. Developing a phased implementation plan, breaking down the project into manageable stages with clear milestones and deliverables. 5. Allocating adequate resources, ensuring sufficient budget, personnel, and time for successful execution. 6. Establishing robust testing and validation procedures, verifying that new systems and processes function as intended. 7. Implementing comprehensive training programs, equipping staff with the necessary knowledge and skills. 8. Continuous monitoring and review, regularly assessing the effectiveness of the implementation and making adjustments as needed. Question 16. Operational review demonstrates that while the firm has distributed the new regulatory guidance document to all relevant departments, there is a noticeable lack of practical application of its core principles in day-to-day workflows, particularly concerning client onboarding procedures. What is the most effective approach to address this implementation gap? Option A. Assign the compliance department to conduct an ad hoc review of a sample of client onboarding files to identify any immediate breaches. Option B. Issue a follow-up memo to all departments reiterating the importance of the new regulation and urging them to review their processes independently. Option C. Conduct targeted training sessions for all staff involved in client onboarding, focusing on practical application of the new regulatory requirements, and implement a revised internal control framework to monitor adherence. Option D. Update the firm's compliance manual with a summary of the new regulation, and assume that staff will adapt their practices accordingly. The correct answer is C. Conduct targeted training sessions for all staff involved in client onboarding, focusing on practical application of the new regulatory requirements, and implement a revised internal control framework to monitor adherence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in financial services, ensuring that new regulatory requirements are not only understood, but also effectively integrated into daily operational workflows. The challenge lies in bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge of a regulation and its practical application, especially when it impacts multiple departments and requires changes to established processes. The firm's obligation is to demonstrate a robust and compliant implementation, not just a superficial one. This requires proactive identification of potential gaps and a structured approach to remediation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, multifaceted strategy that directly addresses the identified implementation gap. This includes a detailed review of existing policies and procedures to ensure alignment with the new regulation, targeted training for all affected personnel to impart practical understanding, and the development of new control mechanisms to monitor ongoing compliance. This approach is best professional practice because it is proactive, systematic, and evidence-based. It directly tackles the root cause of the implementation challenge by ensuring both understanding and practical adherence, thereby minimizing the risk of regulatory breaches and demonstrating a commitment to compliance. This aligns with the overarching regulatory expectation for firms to have effective systems and controls in place. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on a general communication to staff about the new regulation. This fails to address the practical implementation challenge, as it assumes staff will independently translate the regulatory text into actionable changes in their daily work. This approach risks significant gaps in understanding and application, leading to non-compliance and potential regulatory sanctions. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence in ensuring effective implementation. Another incorrect approach would be to focus only on updating internal documentation, without providing any training or practical guidance. While documentation is important, it is insufficient on its own to ensure effective implementation. Staff need to understand how the changes affect their roles and responsibilities, and how to apply the new procedures. Without this, the updated documentation may become a mere formality, failing to achieve its intended purpose and leaving the firm exposed to compliance risks. A third incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire implementation to a single department without cross-functional oversight or input. This can lead to siloed understanding and implementation, potentially creating conflicts with other departments' processes or overlooking critical interdependencies. It also fails to foster a firm-wide culture of compliance, which is essential for effective regulatory adherence. This approach is procedurally flawed and increases the likelihood of incomplete or ineffective implementation. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such implementation challenges should adopt a structured, risk-based approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the regulatory requirements and their implications for the firm's operations. 2. Conducting a gap analysis to identify specific areas where current practices fall short of regulatory expectations. 3. Developing a detailed implementation plan that includes clear objectives, timeline, responsibilities, and resource allocation. 4. Prioritizing training and communication to ensure all affected personnel understand their roles and responsibilities. 5. Establishing robust monitoring and control mechanisms to track progress and ensure ongoing compliance. 6. Regularly reviewing and updating the implementation strategy based on feedback and evolving regulatory landscapes. This systematic process ensures that regulatory obligations are met effectively and efficiently, safeguarding the firm from regulatory scrutiny and maintaining its reputation. Question 17. Strategic planning requires a firm to consider the optimal approach for launching a new financial product to gain a competitive advantage. Given the intense market pressure to be the first to offer a novel investment solution, what is the most prudent and compliant strategy to adopt? Option A. Prioritize sales team feedback on client demand and proceed with launch, assuming their understanding of client needs will suffice for regulatory purposes. Option B. Expedite the product launch to capture market share, with a commitment to retroactively address any identified compliance deficiencies shortly after release. Option C. Outsource all compliance-related due diligence to an external legal firm, allowing the product development team to focus solely on technical implementation and market readiness. Option D. Conduct a thorough risk assessment and integrate necessary compliance controls into the product design and development process prior to market launch. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough risk assessment and integrate necessary compliance controls into the product design and development process prior to market launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in financial services, balancing the need for rapid product rollout with the imperative of robust compliance and risk management. The pressure to be first to market can lead to shortcuts that compromise regulatory adherence and client protection. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating these risks proactively, rather than reactively, which is a core tenet of effective strategic planning in a regulated environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a comprehensive risk assessment and the integration of compliance controls before product launch. This aligns with the principles of a risk-based approach to regulation, which is fundamental in jurisdictions like the UK under FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, oversight. The FCA expects firms to identify, assess, and mitigate risks associated with new products and services. Building compliance into the design phase, often referred to as compliance by design or RegTech integration, ensures that regulatory requirements are met from the outset, minimizing the likelihood of breaches, fines, and reputational damage. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to client best interests and market integrity, key regulatory objectives. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves launching the product with a promise to address compliance gaps post-launch. This is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations. Under FCA rules, firms have an ongoing obligation to ensure their products and services are compliant and suitable for their target market. Delaying compliance measures creates a period of significant regulatory risk, potentially exposing clients to unsuitable products or services and the firm to enforcement action. It demonstrates a failure to adequately consider regulatory obligations during the strategic planning phase. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the sales team's understanding of client needs without formal validation against regulatory suitability requirements. This overlooks the critical need for documented evidence and adherence to specific rules regarding product governance and client categorization. Regulatory frameworks, such as MiFID Roman II, Markets in Financial Instruments Directive Roman II, and its UK implementation, mandate rigorous product governance processes to ensure products are designed and distributed appropriately. A sales-driven approach without this oversight is a recipe for mis-selling and regulatory breaches. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire compliance responsibility to an external legal team without embedding it within the product development lifecycle. While external advice is valuable, the firm itself retains ultimate responsibility for compliance. This approach suggests a lack of internal ownership and integration of compliance, which is a failure of governance and risk management. Regulators expect firms to have robust internal systems and controls, not to outsource their primary compliance obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a challenge should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, clearly identify the strategic objective, e.g., market entry. Second, map out all potential regulatory touchpoints and risks associated with the proposed product or service. Third, consult relevant regulatory guidance and internal compliance policies. Fourth, prioritize the integration of compliance controls and risk mitigation strategies into the product development plan before any launch. Fifth, establish clear lines of accountability for ongoing monitoring and adherence. This systematic approach ensures that strategic goals are pursued within a compliant and ethically sound framework, safeguarding both the firm and its clients. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a senior executive has been making unusually large and frequent cash deposits into their personal account, which are not commensurate with their known salary. The compliance officer suspects potential money laundering activities. Option A. Immediately report the executive's activities to the relevant financial crime enforcement agency without conducting any internal review. Option B. Overlook the suspicious activity due to the executive's senior position and the potential for internal repercussions. Option C. Discuss the executive's cash deposits directly with them to understand the source of the funds. Option D. Initiate a discrete internal investigation to gather further evidence and assess the nature and source of the funds, consulting internal policies and relevant regulatory guidance on suspicious activity reporting. The correct answer is D. Initiate a discrete internal investigation to gather further evidence and assess the nature and source of the funds, consulting internal policies and relevant regulatory guidance on suspicious activity reporting. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potentially illegal activity. The compliance officer must navigate the delicate balance of protecting client information while upholding regulatory requirements and ethical standards. The pressure to act decisively without overstepping boundaries or jeopardizing the firm's reputation adds to the complexity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation of the suspicious activity, adhering strictly to internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. This demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing due diligence and a fact-based assessment before making any definitive conclusions or reporting. It aligns with the ethical principle of acting with integrity and competence, ensuring that any reporting is justified and not based on mere suspicion. Regulatory frameworks often mandate internal investigation procedures for suspicious activities, requiring the compliance officer to gather evidence and assess the situation systematically. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately report the suspicion to external authorities without conducting an internal investigation. This could violate client confidentiality agreements, damage client relationships, and potentially lead to unnecessary regulatory scrutiny if the suspicion is unfounded. It bypasses established internal procedures designed to ensure accuracy and fairness. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the suspicion due to the client's importance or the potential for reputational damage. This is a direct violation of regulatory obligations to monitor for and report suspicious activities, which are designed to prevent financial crime. Ethically, it represents a failure to act with integrity and a dereliction of duty, potentially exposing the firm to significant legal and financial penalties. A third incorrect approach is to discuss the suspicion with the client directly before a formal investigation is complete. This could alert the client to the investigation, allowing them to conceal or destroy evidence, thereby obstructing the investigation and potentially aiding in illegal activity. It also breaches the principle of maintaining confidentiality during an investigation. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, identify the core ethical and regulatory obligations at play. Second, gather all relevant facts and information objectively. Third, consult internal policies and procedures, as well as applicable regulations, to understand the required course of action. Fourth, seek guidance from senior management or legal counsel if the situation is complex or uncertain. Finally, act decisively and ethically based on the gathered information and established guidelines, documenting all steps taken. Question 19. System analysis indicates a financial advisor has been informed by a long-standing client, who is also a significant business owner, about a potential accounting irregularity that could be interpreted as aggressive tax avoidance or even tax evasion. The client expresses concern about the legality of the practice, but also emphasizes the financial benefits and the need for discretion. The advisor suspects this irregularity could violate financial reporting standards and potentially breach anti-money laundering regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Directly confront the client, demanding an explanation and threatening to report them if the practice is not ceased immediately. Option B. Advise the client on how to restructure their business to mitigate the risk of detection and ensure the practice appears legitimate. Option C. Ignore the information, as it is a client's business matter and reporting it could jeopardize the valuable client relationship and future business. Option D. Immediately report the suspected irregularity to the firm's compliance department, providing all relevant details and await further instructions. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the suspected irregularity to the firm's compliance department, providing all relevant details and await further instructions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential financial misconduct. The financial advisor is privy to information that, if true, could have significant legal and regulatory implications for both the client and the firm. Navigating this requires a delicate balance, adhering strictly to the firm's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to established protocols for reporting suspected misconduct. This aligns with best professional practice because it ensures that potential breaches of financial regulations are investigated appropriately, protecting investors and market integrity. It also safeguards the advisor by following a documented process, demonstrating due diligence and ethical conduct. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial services, typically mandate reporting mechanisms for suspicious activities to prevent fraud and market abuse. An incorrect approach that involves directly confronting the client without consulting internal compliance or legal departments is professionally unacceptable. This could breach client confidentiality prematurely, potentially tipping off the client and allowing them to conceal or destroy evidence. It also bypasses the firm's established risk management procedures, potentially exposing the firm to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Furthermore, it places the advisor in a position of investigating and judging the situation independently, which is outside their designated role and expertise. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the information due to a desire to maintain the client relationship, is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This inaction allows potential financial misconduct to continue unchecked, harming investors and undermining market confidence. It also violates the advisor's duty to act with integrity and to report suspected wrongdoing, potentially leading to disciplinary action, loss of license, and legal consequences for both the advisor and the firm. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Recognizing the potential ethical and regulatory red flags. 2. Consulting the firm's internal policies and procedures regarding suspected misconduct. 3. Escalating the concern to the appropriate internal department, e.g., compliance, legal, or a designated ethics officer, without delay. 4. Providing all relevant factual information to the internal department, maintaining objectivity. 5. Following the guidance and instructions provided by the internal department. 6. Maintaining strict confidentiality throughout the process, only discussing the matter with authorized personnel. Question 20. Strategic planning requires a firm to consider new business opportunities. A firm is approached with a lucrative proposal that, if accepted, would create a potential conflict of interest with a significant existing client. The firm's leadership is aware that the new business could enhance the firm's profitability and market position. What is the most ethically sound and professionally responsible course of action for the firm to take? Option A. Decline the new business opportunity outright to avoid any perception of a conflict of interest, regardless of the potential benefits. Option B. Inform the existing client about the new business opportunity, but do not disclose the potential conflict of interest, focusing instead on the benefits the new opportunity might bring to the firm. Option C. Fully disclose the potential conflict of interest to the existing client and obtain their informed consent before proceeding with the new business opportunity. Option D. Proceed with the new business opportunity without informing the existing client. assuming the potential conflict is minor and unlikely to impact their interests. The correct answer is C. Fully disclose the potential conflict of interest to the existing client and obtain their informed consent before proceeding with the new business opportunity. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's fiduciary duty to its clients and the pressure to secure new business, especially when the new business opportunity might involve a conflict of interest. The firm must navigate this delicate balance while upholding its ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. Careful judgment is required to ensure that client interests are not compromised for potential future gains. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes transparency and client consent. By disclosing the potential conflict of interest to existing clients and seeking their informed agreement to proceed, the firm demonstrates adherence to core ethical principles of loyalty and avoiding conflicts. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure and client protection, ensuring that clients are aware of and can consent to any situation that might impact the firm's objectivity or their own interests. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding without full disclosure to existing clients would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This action breaches the duty of loyalty and could be construed as misleading or deceptive conduct, violating principles of good faith and fair dealing. It prioritizes the firm's commercial interests over the client's right to be fully informed and make decisions based on complete information. Another incorrect approach, such as withdrawing from the new business opportunity solely to avoid any potential conflict, might seem cautious but could be professionally suboptimal if the conflict is manageable and clients are willing to consent. While avoiding conflicts is generally prudent, an outright refusal without exploring disclosure and consent options can hinder business growth and may not be the most client-centric or commercially sensible decision in all circumstances. It fails to leverage the possibility of informed client agreement. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the potential conflict of interest. 2. Assess the nature and severity of the conflict. 3. Determine if the conflict can be effectively managed through disclosure and consent. 4. If manageable, prepare a clear and comprehensive disclosure for affected clients. 5. Obtain informed consent from clients before proceeding. 6. If the conflict cannot be managed or clients do not consent, explore alternative solutions, which may include declining the new business or restructuring the engagement. 7. Document all steps taken and decisions made,